what I thought I might talk about today is some of the kind of virtual qualities of climate change and how we know climate change, and just to kind of take seriously this notion of belief or a kind of lack of belief in climate change. Because constantly, whenever I get into a taxi, which is not very often, you come up against that, I do not believe in climate change, or I believe in climate change, or the kind of incredulous questions about how you believe, or you believe this person or that person, and whose kind of word you can take that climate change is really sort of happening. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to open this up a little bit and just think about what the nature of this belief is, and what this notion of a kind of leap into the unknown is, or what kind of commitments have to be made around belief. And partially, obviously, climate change is not something that kind of is based in human experience per se, but and obviously it is in some kind of areas, but it's not a phenomena that we experience as such. We experience weather, we can experience storms, we can experience receding glaciers, but we can't experience climate as such, as a kind of some sort of phenomenon that we can kind of come into in any sort of adequate sense. So it's quite a different kind of human experience that we're being asked to know. And to a certain extent, I'd argue that it's a kind of it's a post-epistemological science, in the sense, or kind of post-epistemological way of thinking about the world, that we might need some more kind of tools to think about with. And if we're going to kind of make these traversals, or even transversals in Guattari's terms, and draw on kind of the preparedness of previous events, or kind of relate these kind of previous events to rehearsals in the future, we kind of need to know something about the kind of question of belief within climate change. And obviously there's a lot of belief-centered questioning in kind of climate skepticism and anti-science. But there's also this kind of there's this kind of question about how we're being asked to take something on that we don't really know in a sort of collective sense as a cultural experience. So I was thinking that rather than dismissing this kind of belief, or not that question again, do you believe in climate change, that we might actually think about it a little bit more. And clearly kind of belief is there in climate change already, because obviously faith groups and so on have taken up climate change because of the way in which it, quite conveniently in a sense, posits social justice on a kind of spectrum, on a global kind of spectre. So it kind of allows a certain kind of connection to be made through climate change that works to the narratives of those existing groups. And clearly there's kind of there's kind of questions around the religious in catastrophism and stewardism, and the kind of notion of the apocalypse and the end of the human species that is prefigured in a lot of discussions about the Anthropocene. So the kind of question that I wanted to ask was that, sort of paraphrasing Nietzsche, is there a kind of religious question in climate change that survives religion, in a sense? Is there a kind of question that we should be thinking about? And even kind of this sort of framing of okay, so that doesn't think that's going to play. But anyway, this is just the kinds of images that we're used to. This animation actually just gets into this red fiery ball by the time we get to like sort of 100 thousand years hence, and it just turns into this kind of, like, it turns into the sun, basically. So there's this kind of, elision with the sun and the earth at the kind of end of time. And we're kind of used to these images of climate change as the kind of, as it ends. And then there's kind of a lot of work, and a lot of the work I've been doing recently is about this kind of thinking about situating the human in climate change, which is a kind of reflection back on origins. So we kind of get these, very much these kind of ends and origins questions coming up again, and trying to think about where we sort of place ourselves culturally within these questions. And also the temporal horizon is very much shifting with the Anthropocene, as kind of as we've just kind of heard, and our way of thinking ourselves, as Sarah says, as kind of plates of humanity, conjure up a very different kind of imaginary about who we are and what our kind of action and interaction with the earth is. And thinking ourselves as fossils is quite a kind of interesting way of that, because the Anthropocene is a kind of fossil record, and therefore, in order to think yourself into the Anthropocene, you have to, in effect, think yourself as a fossil, as a dead kind of remnant, which challenges a certain kind of thinking about afterlife, thinking about kind of a temporal horizon that is not based in the now. So the question I want to ask is whether this kind of thinking about the Anthropocene gives something to this religious character through engagement with these kind of epic scales and these new temporal horizons. And if we take these kind of new temporal horizons as our kind of home, and the question of existence, will our species survive, as a kind of impetus, is there a new form of sublime that's been created that needs a kind of god of reason, or gods of reason, to kind of break its fictitious fall? So climate change is thus variously conceived as capitalism's dirty secret and revenge for some, or the kind of as the kind of atmospheric response to too much hubris and technological mastery. But does in fact climate change demand a god or gods, given that no successful attempt has been made to address climate change through intellectual rationalism, nor through political or economic rationality? So does that further consecrate a religious aspect to these kind of false hopes that, post-Copenhagen, the whole kind of celebration around a kind of coming together was very much kind of turned against itself in its kind of failure to achieve certain things. And so it's this kind of quality of knowing but not knowing, but kind of knowing but not believing enough that we don't actually do anything about climate change, which is a question. And as I said, it brings on questions about what of the kind of human, what of the sort of life course of the human in this kind of epic time frame. And we're kind of all very familiar with the conceptualization of the world in 2015, kind of these, temporal horizon points that we're asked to consider. And they always involved either water or drought. There's always this kind of metaphor of kind of, as you were saying, flows. The flow is very much there in the kind of visual imaginary of those climate change. So rather than kind of a switch now, so rather than thinking about these kind of narratives of salvation and the language of kind of apocalypse, that actually one of the reasons that we might be thinking in these terms, or these imaginations of the future might have so much purchase, is because we've kind of neglected to think about the virtual within climate change, and the kind of the various virtualities or economies of the virtual that inhabit climate change, and the interaction with those virtualities as kind of both imaginaries, but also kind of spaces of kind of imagined occupation. So my question then is belief in climate change about belief at all, or is it about a relation to the virtual and the forms of inhabitation we can make in those virtualities? And how do we kind of need to understand this virtuality in order to generate new effects and sensations? So what would it mean to have a passionate involvement with climate knowledge? What would it mean to feel this change in climate, to listen, like climate scientists do, to the frequency of a human signature in the hum of the universe? What sound would it make? What ears would we need as a listener to apprehend it? What new voice would this offer to the practices of sensation and the multi-vocality of climate knowledge? So how do we actually kind of get inside this knowledge? How do we actually kind of think about this knowledge as something that may actually change our storylines or change our ways of being in the world? So I just want to talk through some of these kind of, just briefly, some of these kind of notions of the future. And clearly climate change is defined as, as these kind of books attest to, but as, very much in the IPCC through its relationship to the future. But one of the things that has been kind of missing, I think, until recently, there's some very good work that's been done around this by Barbara Adam, around the kind of timing of climate change and the kind of the incorporation of the temporal into thinking about climate change. And clearly climate science has been working on this kind of singular notion of time within its predictions. And Nancy calls this immobile duration because it's kind of time understood as being for only the one and not the more than one. So it's kind of stuck in the sort of supposition of an autonomous subject, but a subject of one, a subject that's not joined in any kind of community. And it completely sort of obliterates any notion of kind of difference or differentiated notions of time. And we see this kind of through the kind of tools of climate, a lot of the kind of climate policy planning is this kind of singular, arrow of time that goes through thinking about how we model the future in climate change. So I think one of the things to notice here in terms of, what Nancy says about immobile duration is the kind of modes of subjectivity that are being evoked by the kind of one, by the kind of autonomous subject, and what the kind of forms of address within this are. And so contrary to scientific modellings of futures and arguments about knowledge action gaps, which, Giddens is very famous for, which presume a community of humans, but that it forgets the work that it actually, a commons or a collective of community needs to make in order to be in common. So there's the kind of presumption of a community before community. So that there's the kind of presumption of a collective before the kind of work of a collective. And the same in terms of the kind of temporal horizons. There's this kind of assumption about us all being in one place together. So that's something that I want to kind of query, is this sort of notion of a kind of already collected, already kind of global sensibility of the subject. And there's kind of four dominant times of climate change that tend to get kind of wheeled out, and that's time as a kind of sum of composition of past and future, time as a kind of package. The future is a tellus of the past, so time is linear, which is the most often, but it's starting to get kind of rethought, I think, in climate policy. And then the third is the one that's kind of associated with sustainability literature, and that's the future as a sphere of action, a space of kind of possibility for reconfiguring the present as a kind of emancipatory space. But the fourth is the kind of one that I'm most interested in, and this is kind of drawing from Elizabeth Gross's work on temporalities, and this is the kind of future as the possibility of becoming otherwise, so time as a dislocation. So as a way of thinking about the possibilities of becoming otherwise. So not kind of a continuation of what's in the present, but actually thinking about the new as a dislocation with the present. So not all the resources that we might need to think the future might be contained in the present. So I think we need to pay attention to not to the times of climate, but also to the modes and production of subjectivity under the sign of climate. So we've kind of mentioned about the behavioural, the way in which kind of subjects are configured as these kind of behavioural subjects that need to be better disciplined, etc. But we've also heard about populations and this notion of thinking about humans as a population problem, and that tends to kind of arrange humans in either biological, racial, or even class collectives. We hear a lot about the middle class in China and India, and these kind of ways in which there's these different collectives are always kind of being put together in various kind of action populations. But then we've also got the Anthropocene, which is kind of, trying to think about us as a geological force, as something like an ice sheet, which I think raises some interest. It's a kind of interesting conceptual art project in and of itself. But we're operating at these two poles of either population or individual, a kind of atomization at the level of the individual or the societal. And there's no kind of the sort of models of contagion between these two. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of the ways of kind of configuring difference between these kind of two poles, because they often produce these sterilized modes of production of subjectivity that closely align with the continuation of capitalist models of production. And in fact, as Brom was just saying, it's the very modes of production that generate climate change. And there's this kind of looping back in that reinstates a modality of being that is unchanged by climate change. So it reintroduces a subject that is the kind of the same subject as before. The subject is not kind of, or the forms of subjectivity are not changed by climate change. And I think this is what we need to think about looking at, is how to actually, change these forms of subjectivity, to rethink a new form of subjectivity under climate change. So clearly, the science we're also dealing with in climate change is a virtual science, in the sense that it's kind of modelled. The science, climate science, is only possible because of modelling, because of general circulation models, because of the configuration of a global model. And so this kind of computational power doesn't really kind of help us in answering very many questions around how we come to know climate change, because it's already a virtual model. But climate science is also already a virtual science, in the sense that it's configured towards the future. It's about kind of trying to understand events or kind of changes yet to come. So it's already kind of in deference. And one of the things that we maybe need to think about is kind of how we open up that operative space of climate modelling that renders at the level of the globe in terms of effect, how we kind of begin to find some sort of effective purchase on this kind of globe in the hand, this modelling world that we kind of is always outside of us. And I think there's some questions here in terms of what Brom raised about this kind of Heideggerian notion of like not being in the world or being outside of the world, but never being of the world or with the world, and that we're always kind of situated somewhere else. And that's how we make climate change immediate and effective in its kind of modes of subjective experience is a question. But I think also we've got a science that, particularly in the IPCC, became a narrative science that went from being a kind of iterations of climate models that gave different sort of notions of the future to descriptions of those different kinds of futures. And that it was kind of a subtle shift, but it moved from being a kind of science of iteration of different kind of different models of the future, to a science of describing different social conditions. And that's a very different kind of science to predict, to climate monitoring. And entails a very different kind of responsibility. And you can see that, you know, contra what sort of Latour says, I think that actually scientists, a lot of climate scientists have become very involved with their knowledge to the extent, you know, to often be quite detrimental to their position as a scientist. So I think they have been, a lot of climate scientists have been following through with their knowledge objects. But I think there's clearly a shift in the nature of what climate science is. So I think that's part of understanding lack of effect around climate science. But what would the kind of new blocks of sensation or new forms of virtuality and effect, a kind of virtual ecology of climate look like? And Blanchot suggests if religion is etymologically that which binds, that which holds together, then what of the non-bond, which disjoins beyond unity, which escapes the synchronicity of holding together, yet does so without breaking all relations or without ceasing in this break or in this absence of a relation to open yet another relation? Must one be non-religious for that? So rather than sort of disregarding this sort of notion of kind of belief, what would it mean to think with multiple worlds of climate in which we do have to kind of establish belief around things, belief around kind of both the existence of climate as an effective economy, but also belief around new forms of subjectivity and their kind of prospering in a changed world. So how might a different kind of belief, a new composition of the virtual, open out onto different relations to climate change that are not plagued by the believer or the heretic subject, but that are composed in the spacing between what is known and what is unknown in climate change? John Nancy suggests that we avoid both nihilism, this kind of doctrine of a lack of absolute meaning and value, and the deluded proposition of a solution, which he says elsewhere he kind of calls myth. Is the kind of proposal of pure fulfillment of the desire for absolute meaning and value. So instead we might begin to work between our knowledge and our non-knowledge to tie knots of sense into these knowledge relations and build forms of auto-regeneration, institutions and contracts around these knots of sense, so that we might begin to practice less deadly forms of cohabitation in new atmospheres of climate, while all the time recognising that we're working under condition of communities yet to be built, sensations yet to be rendered, and effects yet to be felt. So rather than assuming or presuming that we're all held together by climate change, so an imaginary of the global, and that we are all in common, we should start from the point of thinking that it is a non-relation, or a relation yet to be given substance and form and emotion, and concentrate instead on how the material forms that climate change bring forth create immaterial entities, and immaterial entities need new material forms to prosper. So Guattari suggests that we cannot conceive of solutions to the poisoning of the atmosphere and global warming or the problem of population control without a mutation of mentality, without a promoting of a new art of living in society. The only acceptable finality of human activity is the production of a subjectivity that is auto-enriching in its relations to the world in a continuous fashion. And to learn the intimate workings of this production, to actually think about the kind of modes of production that enable the possibility of community around climate change. And he says to learn that poetry today might have more to teach us than economic science, human science and psychoanalysis combined. So rather than kind of thinking the subject that needs to be disciplined, or the kind of the sort of liberal subject of kind of environmental capitalism, that actually we need to kind of think about how the connections between forms of intersubjectivity are enriched by the possibilities of new ways of living in the world. So my suggestion is that we attend to the virtual economy of climate that inhabits its material and scientific inhabitations and generate new forms of virtuality, yet to be imagined, and mutant sensibilities that enable new forms of subjectivity, rather than forms of subjectivity that continue to enrich existing detrimental neoliberal modes of being. So trying to kind of imagine climate subjectivity within existing, which a lot of sustainability literature tries to do, is tries to kind of, change the direction of the kind of dinosaur on roller skates. I think something that you used, the kind of something, a phrase like that at lunchtime. But then rather than sort of, as Bataille says, try and sort of, try and tweak the universe like a mechanic, that we actually need to kind of think about a much more audacious form of subject, intersubjectivity, or communities yet to come, that have very much yet to be kind of put into motion. And also within these modes and modes of subjectivity and virtuality, that there are material and immaterial knowledge economies that are kind of filled with excesses that need to be addressed, that are both virtual and real. And these kind of excesses, in the sense that the excess of our ability to know or account for them, the kind of immaterial dimensions of force and effect of change that exceed our experiences, but they're also excesses in terms of exclusion, or the kind of forms of exclusion that make it impossible to kind of to think the world differently, to kind of be in the world differently. So I would suggest that we need to attend to these excesses to create an abundance or potentiality in our knowledge, but also in the way in which these excesses are excluded from these formations and left out of our accounts. So, and as such, these are kind of differentiated experiences of climate change. So this is kind of, it's not just about sort of excess as this kind of wild exuberance, but excess as this kind of exclusion. That makes it impossible to kind of to bring different knowledge economies together. Such exclusions, I would argue, of these differentiated experiences, render climate change normative and flatten the very focus on the kind of, on the possibility of changing sense of relation to climate change. So we are in a lot of the sustainability literature, the focus is on the everyday practices rather than any kind of engagement with the sort of geological exuberance of climate change. And clearly we need to do both, but I think kind of to exclude one in favour of the other suggests that we're still kind of working under the same kind of sign of a very kind of conservative notion of the subject. So rather than sort of neutralise the possibilities of kind of climate change through kind of making it normative in various different ways, that actually we might take some of that power and some of that kind of energy that is generated around climate change to think new forms of being in the world. So I had a go at the questions as well. My storylized, but I think that we need to attend to the virtual economy of climate change. So every knowledge act needs to be attentive to the virtual possibilities that accompany it, those that engage, exclude, flatten, normalise, expose, to work within a general economy of climate change. Here I'm drawing on Bataille's work of kind of general economy. That every knowledge act always contains excesses that are beyond the immediate temporal horizon, exteriority, and visible surface, and include forms of exclusion, and to work under the auspices of a community around the phenomena of climate change is yet to come. And in that sense, that every knowledge act needs to tie knots of relations and knots of sense rather than kind of presume that these are already in existence and that we're already in a global economy of climate change.